Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's talk on ecotheology and literature, prospects and challenges, held by Farm for Change at the Institute of European American Studies, Academia Sinica, Taiwan. My name is Serena Zhou, and I'm an Associate Research Fellow of American Literature and Environmental Literature here at the Institute. Farm for Change is an interdisciplinary ideal lab of the Institute dedicated to the study of ecopoetics and climate justice. Since 2002, Farm for Change has invited many great speakers from around the world. They have given enlightening talks for which we have gotten many positive feedbacks. We tend to invite scholars whose ideas have shaken how we think or see the world. Using these ideas as seeds, we hope to farm for change. So you can find all the past talks at our Farm for Change website. Today's speaker, George Handley, is definitely someone whose ideas has changed how we see the world. Professor George Handley is a professor of comparative literature and interdisciplinary humanities at Brigham Young University. He is a post-colonial eco-critic and a former pro-president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. His books include New World Poetics, Nature and the Adamic Imagination of Whitman, Neruda, and Wilcott, Caribbean Literature and the Environment, co-edited with Elizabeth Delore and Renee Gostin, and Post-Colonial Ecologies, co-edited with Elizabeth Delore. He is currently finishing a book-length study of ecotheology and literature entitled From Chaos to Cosmos on the post-secularity of the environmental humanities. It is with great pleasure that we have Professor George Handley with us today, and we look forward to listen to his turn from post-colonial ecology to ecotheology. Thank you. And let's welcome Professor George Handley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cho. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even though it's only virtually. I've never been to Taiwan and hope to make it there someday and would love to meet in person, but I'm grateful that we have technological means to meet otherwise, and I'm grateful for your attention tonight and for the honor of the invitation. Tonight, I'd like to share a portion of the book that was just mentioned that I'm going to be publishing later this year with Routledge. And as Dr. Cho alluded to, I have sort of taken a turn in my own research temporarily away from post-colonial concerns that I've been more directly involved in for many years to ecotheology. This project is more especially focused on Christian ecotheology and contemporary American literature. Although I'm also now sort of beginning to explore the post-colonial implications of some of the things that I have been writing about with regard to the American writers that I've chosen. The writers in my study are Cormac McCarthy, Marilyn Robinson, Annie Dillard, and a Western writer, David James Duncan. But I think, and I won't be talking about any specific novelists or creative writers today, but I'll just be kind of laying out some of the tensions between ecotheology and literary studies and ecocriticism in particular, and why those two fields really need to come together. So, and I'll look forward to any questions you have. Obviously, I don't have the ear to hear how my own research might sound to you in your various contexts of study and locations. And I'm not an Asianist, and I'm not familiar with as much of that part of the world as I should be. So I'm eager to learn from you about ways in which things I share tonight may or may not be useful or need to be reconsidered in light of your experience and insights. So let me begin by just pointing out that since its beginnings in the early 1990s, eco-criticism has sought to find environmental wisdom from literature. At first, primarily in the Anglo-American tradition, when eco-criticism first took off, and now in a much more global context, even as it has also sought to deconstruct narratives that hide environmentally dangerous assumptions and attitudes. Eco-criticism has leaned on rhetorical analysis of the relationship of the human and the non-human throughout human cultural history. And in this way, it seeks to, in the words of Greg Gerard, contribute constructively to the diagnosis and resolution of ecological problems. It is wanted, in other words, to build a critical apparatus that could be used by readers of literature and of culture at large, to put it most simply, to make better environmentalists. And now, as a full-blown project of environmental humanities, eco-criticism participates in the larger project of moral reform that I think is at the heart of environmentalism, which is, as Lawrence Buell intuited many years ago, in his words, eco-criticism is itself, or at least entails, a faith commitment. The morality of the environmental humanities and its fundamental faith are not always comfortably acknowledged. However, we eco-critics read, teach, and write about literature and the environment because we believe that we face a crisis that requires the right actions and the right behavior, and that literature contains wisdom and values that can shape our behavior in relation to the earth. And we believe that in exercising our critical skills of reading and interpretation, our students will develop better tools to mitigate, if not avoid, deception and error and environmental degradation. But because we often see ourselves as a corrective to more dogmatic ideologies and worldviews that have blocked our ability to respond to the environmental crisis effectively, we eco-critics are sometimes less inclined to admit to our own metaphysical leaps of faith. The truth is, however, we seek more than just an attitudinal adjustment or reorientation for the reader, but a firm moral commitment, even a kind of conversion that inspires sustained and devoted effort and lived experience. Whatever else might be said of the deficiencies and dangers of humanism in the context of a climate crisis, true to the heart of the project of humanism, eco-critics very much hope that reading and interpretation matter for how we live. In this sense, eco-criticism can ill afford to deny its own serious moral commitments to the humanities. Although humanism represents, even in its beginnings, a secular departure from certain theological understandings of human being, and even though it has continued on a more secular trajectory ever since, the climate crisis has generated what some might call a post-secular culture of moral concern about our future that draws heavily from the rhetoric of religion, if not borrowing from it directly. We might say that environmentalism is what Bruno Latour calls a religious counter-religion that still depends on the theological and cosmological style of thought that we often associated with religion. Eco-critics are not altogether unaware of this, as is evident by the sometimes good humor with which they describe their conversions to the eco-critical project and the religious zeal with which they preach the eco-critical gospel. However, this similarity is not merely accidental, nor just an example of a kind of rhetorical borrowing. Environmentalism, at least in its American strain, owes a great deal to Christian belief and practice, and I would imagine in other national contexts to other religious contexts as well. Post-colonial environmentalism has similarly drawn inspiration from various indigenous and non-Western beliefs. Environmentalism is, in other words, an outgrowth of a profound theological commitment that once motivated, and as many eco-theologians are arguing today, could still motivate care for the earth. The truth is, however, that for many eco-critics, environmentalism's religious roots are more a source of embarrassment today than of inspiration, to the degree that they are recognized at all. If the most recent biennial meeting of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment is any indication, an organization, as Dr. Cho mentioned, I was co-president of for the last 2 years, there was a grand total of 1 paper out of more than 900 participants that explicitly addressed theology, 2 panels that addressed spiritual practices and environmental ethics in Asia, and 1 panel on spirituality and plants. Even though more opportunities were there, including a keynote address by David James Duncan, a writer who writes pretty explicitly about religious themes, and a panel of indigenous activists who were fighting for the salmon, who spoke explicitly about their spiritual orientation as impetus for their work. The co-edited collection, Environmental Criticism for the 21st Century, published in 2011, offered no guidance for future dialogue between sacred and secular literature, a significant oversight for our present century. That isn't to say that the connection has been ignored altogether. John Gaida's 2004 book, Making Nature Sacred, Literature, Religion, and the Environment in America from the Puritans to the Present, broke this ground 20 years ago, even though it flew below most radars. Timothy Burberry explored the connection between Christianity and the environment in 2012 in Christianity and Literature, arguing that the environmental crisis is cause for critics to re-examine the thesis regarding the constructedness of language, especially vis-a-vis the natural world. Joshua Mabey followed up in the same journal a few years later to argue that the post-colonial turn in eco-criticism helped to create a better balance and maybe even a confluence between the human and more than human realms of concern that opened a path for a kind of Christian interest. Of course, the broader field of religion and literature, which treats that relationship in a global context these days, has a lot to offer, even though the eco-theological connection is often not made. Eco-criticism's strong and sustained critique of anthropocentrism has perhaps stalled engagement with eco-theology, just as it stalled the interventions of post-colonial criticism, even though staunch anti-anthropocentrism continues to contradict eco-criticism's significant humanistic commitments. I myself have been one voice among others who have worked to open the field of post-colonial eco-criticism over the past 20 years. I believe the post-colonial turn in eco-criticism offered indispensable corrections to the eco-critical temptation to pit environmental against human social concerns and to espouse naive understandings of nature's sacred innocence and humankind's almost constitutional toxicity and fallenness. Indeed, this was a corrective to a tendency of many biocentric arguments to resemble traditional Christian theologies of the fall. Post-colonial criticism did right by giving better focus to historicity in the study of nature and culture, and by remaining focused on identifying the dual colonial legacies of social injustice and environmental degradation. It has helped pave the way toward a more global and interdisciplinary environmental humanities that hopefully can avoid the pitfalls of Western colonialism. Historicizing environmentalism and its moral impulses has been an important strategy for avoiding the pitfalls of making apolitical appeals to nature as if the implied morality of the natural world were singular, coherent, or accessible. As Bruno Latour simply notes, quote, "The more you talk about staying within the limits of what is natural, the less you will get general agreement," end quote. He rightly insists, quote, "We have not seen a single case in which the appeals to the laws of nature have permitted an automatic alignment of interests," end quote. The possibility of neocolonialisms is ever present, and one of the easiest ways to give colonialism a fighting chance is paradoxically to become too dogmatic or militant in our resistance to it. Believing in and pursuing a perfect morality is a formula for new forms of intolerance. When we believe that the moral failures of colonialism are definitively housed in certain geographies, languages, cultures, or worldviews, we also erroneously imply that alternative geographies, languages, cultures, and worldviews, most specifically ours, are therefore safe. That is to say, what endangers post-colonialism is the same thing that endangers environmentalism and religion, the temptation of ideology. Ideologization happens, according to Czech philosopher Erazim Kohak, quote, most easily where thought does not stand in constant confrontation with a problem, end quote. We might say then that ideologies render both problems and solutions inevitable and natural. When believers imagine problems as having origins in something other than our own shared human agency, and the solutions involving only logical deduction but no challenging discernment or anxiety. Indeed, the purpose of ideologization seems to be to reduce, if not eliminate, the burden of our own agency and accountability, and the concomitant possibility of our own well-meaning attentions going awry and yielding tragic consequences. Ideologies are defined by the problems they see, but they always allow believers to feel that a theoretically diagnosed problem, by virtue of being diagnosed, does not then have to be faced and solved. Facing practical problems, on the other hand, as Kohak insists is necessary, mitigates against the temptation of ideology by keeping the primacy of experience, keeping our focus on the primacy of experience and not on the primacy of concepts and ideas. The challenge, of course, is greatest when the problem we seek to solve seems to challenge the fundamental assumptions of our most deeply held and long-cherished worldviews. This is what has happened, for example, to conservative Christianity in my country in the face of climate change. Contemporary environmental problems present unprecedented levels of complexity that make identifying individual accountability especially difficult, especially in Western cultures, and thus they present special challenges to our ability to identify appropriate responses. As Willis Jenkins, ecotheologian at University of Virginia, has shown, in the face of such unprecedented or unanticipated circumstances like those of alarming rates of species extinction, climate change, or often invisible and toxic pollution, it is not uncommon for people to respond with denial as a way to protect the integrity of their traditions and values. This is especially true, argues Bruno Latour, if the argument of climate change is that the apocalypse is coming, when for those already reaping the benefits of capitalism and a resource-rich environment, the apocalypse has already taken place. He writes, they have already gone over to the other side. The world of the beyond has been achieved. In any case, for those who have become wealthy, they have already crossed the threshold that puts an end to historicity, end quote. The only problem, of course, is that the values that deniers cling to are not only inadequate to the problems they face, but they may very well turn out to be the result of a poor or misguided interpretation of tradition. In other words, the Christian theology that's often used to deny climate change is very, very poorly Christian. What is called for is not reinforced defensiveness in the face of the unprecedented or unanticipated, but creative reformulations of tradition in light of an honest assessment of new circumstances. As Jenkins explains, quote, people can learn new moral competencies by participating in projects that use their inheritances to create new responsibilities for unexpected problems, end quote. This is more likely to happen if environmental problems are presented in such a way that does not expect or demand an abandonment of one's most deeply held beliefs, but instead encourages a creative reinterpretation of tradition in light of the unprecedented, even if it involves new hybrid forms of belief. Social science confirms that people tend not to be persuaded by strategies that shame, belittle, or ignore one's most cherished values and beliefs. In fact, such strategies tend to inspire people to dig in their heels of opposition with even greater vehemence, right? Climate activism that simply points a finger at certain worldviews and say, you essentially have the wrong view and you need to change your worldview, are not effective. Common ground is found when appeals are made to the highest and best instincts within different worldviews, rather than starting with the assumption that common ground is only possible if one group sacrifices what they hold most dear. Climate change has certainly created a religious crisis, but the crisis is felt in both religious and secular contexts. As Latour has argued, religious fundamentalism is in many ways a desire for assured and indisputable knowledge that was intended to combat the rising certainty of science. This desire, however, has only been mimicked by a similar surfeit of certainty in the counter-religion of secular science. He writes, "The reaction to the various forms of fundamentalism can blind us. As a result, by writing religion, science has lost its connection with itself. By fighting science, religion has lost track of its most valuable asset," end quote, which is its capacity to inspire moral concern. It is almost silly to have to say the obvious. Not everyone agrees about the true nature of the cosmos and of ultimate reality. Disagreement on such matters, in fact, seems fundamental to our global reality. If we start with the assumption that the climate crisis is fundamentally caused by disagreement over one's answers to life's biggest questions, or that its solution is only found in agreement, then we have created a much bigger problem than that of the climate. We invite, as Latour rightly suggests, quote, "the return of the wars of religion from which the state was supposed to protect us," end quote. It is not an overstatement to say that today's culture wars are really wars of religion, or at least of cosmological conviction, pitched as mutually exclusive. Disagreement and the plurality of perspectives are supposedly well-known and comfortable realities to anyone within even strictly secular eco-critical circles. Readers cannot agree on which texts matter the most or have the most to offer, let alone what precisely individual works even mean. But if such agreement were possible, we literary critics would be out of work. We can only conclude that the reason sacred texts and theological questions aren't brought into eco-critical debates is because a rather anti-humanistic certainty that secular values alone define or should define the field. If work in the environmental humanities is expended on behalf of persuading others of the correct worldview, we will do little to move the needle on behavior across cultures. I understand that talking about theology, as I intend to do here, in the context of literary criticism might be perceived as at worst inappropriate or at best narrowly sectarian. My goal, however, is pragmatic and moral. Christian ecotheology gets most of my attention in my study because Christian theology is almost invariably the implied problem in many eco-critical discussions in my country, if the relative frequency with which Lynn White, and not much else in the eco-theological literature, is cited is any indication. It seems that White is cited more often as proof of the irrelevance of religion rather than as one of the catalysts that gave birth to the field of ecotheology. Lynn White, we must remember, cited St. Francis as an example of the kind of theology he believed Christianity would do well to resuscitate, insisting that if the problem is essentially religious, so too is the solution. Today, the greening of religion represents one of the most significant changes in global religious culture of the last century, a change that unfortunately remains virtually unknown and often irrelevant in eco-critical circles. Climate solutions, of course, are not merely technological or scientific, but cultural. This should not be a surprise to anyone. This should not be a surprise argument for anyone working in the environmental humanities. But if we are overly preoccupied with defending a worldview or demanding scientific literacy as its own silver bullet, or insisting on the dangers of anthropocentrism without any interest in meeting doubters where they are at, we are not really doing cultural work at all. To believe that people respond to shame, to cultural warfare, and to intimidation is not to understand the first thing about how cultures change and to fall victim to the allures of polarization, which I think is one of the greatest plagues of our age. It makes little sense to me to believe in the value of the humanities and then turn around and claim that humanism is the essence of the problem. Even the work of establishing a more biocentric human culture is humanistic work. As Erazim Kohak wisely puts it, quote, humanism becomes defensible when what we take as definitive of our humanity is the ability to transcend the narcissism of our species, end quote. I cannot believe in the need for moral change without also believing in its possibility. And I cannot believe in its possibility without also believing that the humanities, including religion, can and should play a central role. I once presented the argument that I'm making here that eco-critics needed to be better versed in eco-theology at a conference on the futures of environmentalism. And a prominent eco-critic and friend said, perhaps half jokingly, but maybe only half, why don't we just get rid of religion? In my experience, even the hint of such an attitude in the classroom would immediately and definitively limit my reach. Most of my students, I teach at a religious institution, and most of my students are religious, so I have to meet them where they're at. What I said in response to my friend was, good luck with that. You will have more luck getting rid of climate change than getting rid of religion. As Bruno Latour notes, we have the option of rejection and denial, of course, but, quote, how can we cope if in this move we bring with us the worst religions have to offer in the very form of secular dogmatism and leave aside the antidote that they have also been able to develop, namely the self-scrutiny and self-doubt that religion can inspire. With our strange idea of the secular, we can neither return to the religious nor extricate ourselves from it, end quote. The humanities for too long neglected the environment, but it continues to neglect religion. In my 10 years of formal education in exclusive humanism at Stanford University and at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1980s and 1990s, I was never once introduced to the idea that literature had anything meaningful to say about the environmental crisis. Moreover, I do not recall being introduced to any serious religious thinker, Christian or others, after I encountered Martin Luther in a freshman humanities class. While the former problem has been addressed by the robust rise of eco-criticism since the 1990s, a wave I was fortunate enough to catch just as I came out of graduate school and began my career at Northern Arizona University, the latter remains stuck in low gear, at least in the eco-critical circles that I walk in. Of course, that has caught flame in eco-theology. According to the Pew Templeton Global Religious Futures Project, although the United States, Australia, and other countries are experiencing a decline in religious affiliation, religion remains very important in most areas of the world, and it is projected that by 2050, only 13% of the world will have no religious affiliation. Some climate activists like to joke when asked if they believe in climate change that they don't need to have faith to believe in reality. But at times it seems we are actually much less empirical in our approach to social reality, unwilling to engage the reality of religion in the cultural landscape, but also unwilling to admit the social conditioning of our confidence and pride in our empiricism and rationality. In a world where religiosity persists and even thrives, it is simply irresponsible to imagine a global or national future for environmentalism that doesn't address religion. Moreover, formal religious affiliation and belief do not adequately account for the myriad ways in which religion has migrated and transformed itself across a myriad secular practices and assumptions. And that is what I understand is the insight of post-secular theory and criticism. If our focus is on fighting the battle over worldviews rather than on fighting for the more practical and measurable goal of actually reducing carbon emissions, maybe it is fair to question if we really have the earth in mind. If it is possible that we do not, maybe secularists are not as secular as they think they are, since at least one measure of secularity was supposed to be the ability of the self to be aware of and suspend some disbelief in the face of the viability of different worldviews. It is ironic in a way to realize that what Charles Taylor describes as the porous self of pre-modern cultures that saw itself interpenetrated by divine forces in the world around us was more familiar with the concept of interdependence and might have been better equipped than the modern and secular buffered self to engage across differences. If we want to insist that secularity is the only solution to the climate crisis, and I am by no means convinced, as you no doubt have surmised by now, we should be aware that this means we are insisting on the value of a self that no longer feels porously in contact with animated places and beings. Echoing Jenkins' argument, Amitav Ghosh, one of the world's most prominent post-colonial writers, suggests that in the context of global cultures, shaped by secular and sacred literature alike, what facilitates change in the face of unprecedented challenges is not what he says, the discovery of something new, but a recognition of, quote, renewed reckoning with a potentiality that lies within oneself. This is very similar to what Willis Jenkins was arguing. The alternative, he says, is the persistence of what he calls the great derangement, where cultures about climate change, that is as much a phenomenon of religious and secular cultures. As I noted, when cultures experience crisis, they can feel threatened by the unprecedented. They can choose to awake to their own inadequacy in light of the new phenomena and find a productive way forward. But the key is creativity to reimagine resources from within, not an inflexible denial or negative protectiveness about what lies without. Facing problems, as Kohak suggests, inspires resistance to the temptation of denial and inspires a creativity that has sustained lasting religious and secular cultures over time. Creativity, not ideologization, especially in relation to how we read and interpret, is what we need to confront the very real problems of our current crisis. Creativity, rather than defensiveness, may be the measurable difference between a moral response to the climate crisis and further denial. In his 1992 Nobel speech, St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott said, quote, "Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole." I'll read that again. Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. Walcott underscores here that the best response to fragmentation and crisis are acts that are morally serious enough to defy fragmentation by reassembling a viable imagined wholeness, even if it is contingent. The path forward, in other words, in the wake of wreckage, is not rebellion or reversal per se, but a creative amalgamation and reformulation or a retelling of inherited traditions to serve new ends. This is very much in the spirit of what one contemporary indigenous ecologist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, has been arguing here in the United States since the publication of her marvelous book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Latour similarly argues that we need to see ourselves composing the world in the creative act of reassembling order as we seek to make sense of and make right by the world. Religion and art should both understand, quote, "Creation has not been completed, and it therefore must be composed, step by step, soul by soul, agent by agent," end quote. It might be a political reality in the United States that climate change remains largely a concern of the mostly secular left, but this hardly seems to be a long-term solution. When ecology is rendered a special interest, the existential problems we need to face together risk becoming, in Kohak's words, merely a, quote, "shared false consciousness of a certain sect, not a pressing question for all humanity," end quote. I suppose the willingness of eco-critics to engage conservative and or Christian or other ecotheological thought would be one measure of our willingness to move beyond our own sectarian and ideological impulses as eco-critics. Curiously, a militantly secular eco-criticism that immunizes against doubt risks a US-centered parochialism that most eco-critics agree we should be well beyond by now. In his book, The Post-Secular Imagination, Post-Colonialism, Religion, and Literature, Manav Rati brilliantly exposes iterations of the ideology of secularism, particularly its assumption about its own tolerance, modernity, and progressivism, that is juxtaposed to assumptions about religion as its other, reminding us of the Orientalist legacies of such assumptions. Secular ideologies manifest a failure to make proper account of religious cultures in post-colonial contexts and the ways in which post-colonial writers continue to make use of a religious ethos to stimulate faith, awe, wonder, and transcendence for post-colonial ends. Such ideologies are similarly blind to the many environmental ends to which religion is put today. While Ghosh offers faint praise for literature's achievements thus far in the face of climate change, he sees the involvement of religion in the climate crisis as, quote, the most promising development in culture, end quote, in part because of its ties to, quote, forms of traditional knowledge, material skills, art, and ties of community, end quote. The reason for his enthusiasm is simple. Quote, the formal political structures of our time are incapable of confronting this crisis on their own, and the basic building block of those structures is the nation state. What is also inadequate in Western culture's secular obsession with what is also inadequate is Western culture's secular obsession with an individual moral adventure. By contrast, he sees religions as being well suited to talk about intergenerational ethics, community ethics, and to think beyond the nation state, to think more collaboratively and interdependently. He says it is impossible to see any way out of this crisis without an acceptance of limits and limitations, and this in turn is, I think, intimately related to the idea of the sacred, end quote. So, of course, such uses of religion are by no means guaranteed, least of all in contexts where religion has already enjoyed a long colonial history or has been hijacked by the nation state or by an obsessive individualism or a political ideology. The point, however, isn't to assume ideological fixity in religion, but to liberate, again, the potentiality that lies within it, as Ghosh describes it. So I am convinced that, as Ghosh argues, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus a crisis of the imagination. I would only underscore that one aspect of that crisis is precisely the polarized divide between secularity and religion that continues to shape eco-criticism, and that my study is, I hope, is intended to transcend. Environmental thought has argued for decades that we are guilty as a species of thinking too selfishly, and I concur wholeheartedly. But that selfishness doesn't just hurt nature. It blocks us from being able to sort out and work across our human differences so that we might act more collectively on its behalf. It may be that the most potent forces that harm the planet are not greenhouse gases alone, but the cultural biases that prevent us from communicating across differences and allowing us to see more accurately where true differences lie. Those differences include race, class, gender, sexuality, geography, but also religion. I agree with Pope Francis that we are more dangerous to the world, the more dangerous we are to one another. With a diminished capacity to tolerate our differences and to find common ground, we are more likely to judge prematurely and erroneously, exclude potential allies we believe fall short, no matter how right we might otherwise be. The cost of failing to invite those who might otherwise come along to be part of the solution. There is a temptation here to imagine that the problems we face are of such gravity that no watered-down version of the truth will do. We are not wrong to insist on a proper understanding of the true nature of reality, but we too often mistakenly assume that a proper understanding of the true nature of reality is reliably and universally accessible, and that it doesn't have multiple dimensions. Such a mistake places the burden of our work on behalf of the planet on the task of fighting over ideas instead of identifying and motivating the right practices. And it assumes, again mistakenly, that those practices will necessarily come from that understanding. This is what I would call a deterministic fallacy. If you believe X, you will behave in an X way. As every Christian knows, St. James rightly insisted that belief matters, but it is also its own temptation. Hearing the word, but not doing the word, means that one becomes persuaded that belief alone defines one's morality all by itself, leaving one to forget what manner of human he was. That's a paraphrase from James. There is more. Does not a proper understanding of the true nature of reality also include the reality of staggering diversity and complexity of human motivations, the reality of different and competing worldviews that will not go away just because we deem them wrong? And that is to say, what about what manner of humans surround me? Is it not a serious risk to expend energy fighting a culture war over worldviews instead of seeking cultural understanding? It does indeed seem strange to hear environmentalists insisting on the values of cooperation and interdependency if they end up acting more like cultural chauvinists than ambassadors. As Kohak has suggested, one way to avoid conflict is to make sure we are facing problems and facing them together, not facing ideas or facing each other. Another way is to consider the common ground between secularity and religion, and especially between literature and ecotheology, particularly the implicit impulse we all share to imagine and be motivated by our ideas about the cosmos itself. What I want to do now is transition into a slightly different concept, and that is that we think of the Anthropocene as that our reactions to climate change need to be worked through. And what I want to suggest is that our reactions to climate change are often influenced or informed by an already preset set of views or reactions to nature itself. In other words, how we conceive of the disturbing facts of climate change is influenced by how we already think about the disturbing facts about how we assume nature behaves. In his 1950s treatise on love, Jose Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, makes an almost offhanded remark that seems now in retrospect to be the most important insight of his reflections. He writes that what motivates attention and affection is something deeper than love, something he calls, quote, metaphysical sentiment, end quote. Or, as he also puts it, quote, the basic impression which we have of the universe, end quote. He explains, quote, this metaphysical sentiment acts as a foundation and support for our other activities, whatever they may be. No one lives without it, although its degree of clarity varies from person to person. It encompasses our primary decisive attitude toward all of reality, the pleasure which the world and life hold for us. Our other feelings, thoughts, and desires are activated by this primary attitude and are sustained and colored by it, end quote. We could think of this metaphysical sentiment as the sum total of our answers, however tentative or incomplete, to the big questions of life. Why is there something rather than nothing? What explains life? Why are we alive? Who are we? What is our purpose? What is our future? Where did we come from? There are, of course, both secular and religious answers to these questions, just as there are secular and religious ways of handling their mystery. But Ortega y Gasset suggests that those answers in any combination are at play in our response to the world and how we form affections and attachments. However, precisely because they are metaphysical, these questions can also be especially divisive. The public sphere is characterized by what theologians Miroslav Volf and Matthew Croasmun have called, quote, contending particular universalisms, end quote, wherein competing cosmologies and faiths vie for supremacy. To lower the heat of such encounters, they urge believers and non-believers alike to develop an implicit understanding within their own particular universalisms of what it means to be part of a plurality. Of course, religionists and secularists alike often fail to admit to their own implicit intolerance for plurality. But I like Ortega y Gasset's idea that universalism can be a sentiment that informs, not a radical certainty that fixes our worldview. Bruno Latour argues that one solution to this potentially perpetual war of contending universalisms is simply to be upfront about what one's answers are to a few basic questions about our cosmology. And these are his questions. Who or what is our supreme authority? What are the boundaries or limits to who we are in our collective identity? What is the territory we believe we are defending? And from what epoch or moment in culture and time do we understand ourselves to be speaking? And what do we believe accounts for the distribution of agency in the world? This is what he means by allowing politics, being upfront in our answers to those questions. To forget the limits of any one cosmology and to disallow any questions about it is to try to forego politics, as Latour understands the term. Secularism is a response to an awareness of a plural world, but it never meant that we had to forsake a belief in the world's unity, only that we acknowledge our beliefs individually and collectively as choices. The point is that we have to learn to see ourselves doing the work of composing a cosmology. As Latour notes, religion and science are not separable because, quote, the same question confronts all cosmologies. What does it mean for a people to measure, represent, and compose the form of the earth to which they find themselves attached, end quote. This implies more listening, more honesty, more modesty, and perhaps more creativity about our metaphysics. In simpler terms, we could say that the strength of one's faith notwithstanding, a gap remains between what one knows of reality and what one trusts is beyond our knowledge, and that there can be no pretension of neutrality or objectivity on these questions. A foundational claim I wish to make, then, is that stories, either those offered in fiction or in science narratives, are inescapably, even if often indirectly, cosmological in their reach and faithful in their hope in succeeding. The great questions are at play in the stories we tell and inform the reason for the telling. Stories, in other words, both shape and are motivated by our basic impressions of the universe. If we turn to literature in the hope that it might reform, reshape, and reanimate our moral imagination, we can ill afford to ignore the cosmological reach it has, especially since, as fiction, it performs that reach rhetorically, as an aesthetic, rather than as a purely religious or scientific act, allowing us to see plurality at the same time it inspires belief in possibility. We can ill afford to be naive about the many ways in historical and social conditions. We can ill afford to be naive about the many ways historical and social conditions inevitably limit that reach of literature, but to reduce literature to its merely secular context and ignore its serious ambition to access the transcendent is to rob it of that power to tap into the cosmological imagination of readers. Writers who move us the most are those who help to rearrange, metaphorically speaking, the furniture of our cosmos, not just our living rooms, even if, or precisely because, they also inspire more questions and more searching. We cannot expect literature to change us, however, if we don't believe it is asking or offering contingent answers about the fundamental questions of existence. Getting at its reach for ultimacy should be at the very heart of what motivates our criticism, and this should in turn motivate our familiarity with the various and tentative answers about ultimacy that have been offered by ecotheology. Erazim Kohak is correct when he says that for environmentalism to be effective, we have to acknowledge that even the very secular and telluric context of ecological ethics gets at the very fundamental question of the meaning of human being on the earth. He adds, quote, whether an environmental quest for living in harmony with the life of nature, seeking long-range sustainable modes of living makes any sense at all depends on the way we understand the place of good and evil in the world. despite whatever discomfort it might cause. An important implication of Kohak's point is that we should never be shy about getting directly at such questions, and we should be upfront first and foremost about our own answers to them. In our age of polarization, there is a temptation to hush such conversations or to leave them out of the classroom and out of scholarship, as if they were vaguely inappropriate to a more impersonal and scholarly approach to our work. Although confessions of how we identify are increasingly common, it is not clear yet that confessions about religious persuasion or cosmological convictions are keeping pace or are as welcomed. Any posture that pretends neutrality on the existential questions would seem to be counterproductive. Religion is not always easy to define, but one definition from social science, from Paul Griffiths, is that religions are, quote, communities of belief and practices oriented around claims about the ultimate grounds of existence. Griffiths adds, quote, to be religious means to give a religious account of the world that is marked by three elements. It is comprehensive, it concerns issues of central importance for human thriving, and it is unsurpassable, by which he means that a practitioner holds a religious account as true in a deep fundamental way, not just for herself, but for others as well. In these definitions, we would certainly have to admit that religion isn't exclusively relegated to the experience of church, but is a pervasive experience in culture, and is at stake whenever ultimate questions are addressed or believed to be answered in definitive ways, even if there is ample room for tolerance and cooperation across worldviews. Latour would suggest that, quote, there is no such thing as an irreligious collective, end quote, and that there are, quote, only collectives that have modified the name and the properties of the supreme authority in whose name they gather, end quote. As John Caputo similarly asserts, quote, consciously or not, avowedly or not, the political order has theological roots. Whenever we order political space, we also have God on our mind, end quote. Cormac McCarthy thematizes this in his novel, The Crossing, which is a focus of my study. He says, quote, in the end, we shall all of us be only what we have made of God, end quote. That being the case, the difference between Latour as philosopher and Latour as theologian begins to break down. All I mean to suggest is that environmentalism is, at times, and for good reasons, shares many of the same characteristics of religion, and as such, it could learn from ecotheology how to do its own kind of theologizing more deliberately and consciously in its similar effort to rehabilitate culture. The good news is eco-critics don't have to invent a religious environmental ethic. Ecotheology is already a robust field that offers abundant answers to the many obstacles that other believers, less environmentally inclined, have presented in responding to the crisis of the climate. The eco-theological rereadings of religious traditions are not so different from eco-critical rereadings of literature. In both cases, the emphasis is not only on finding the texts that have the basic impressions of the universe we believe have the best chances to motivate moral concern, but also on identifying the critical strategies of reading that prove to yield the best fruit suited for the Anthropocene. At the risk of beating an almost dead horse, eco-critical negligence of these advances of ecotheology is, to put it lightly, a significant oversight. Otherwise, we risk sending our scholarship and our students into the trenches of the culture wars to expend more energy on fighting for the right worldview than on identifying the best behavior. In my concluding section here, let me just say that so much hinges not only on what is read, but how one reads. And this should not surprise eco-critics. In fact, this is the heart and soul of eco-criticism. Ventures in humanistic inquiry and criticism are never guaranteed success in inspiring the right motivations, the right behavior, but they are underwritten by no small measure of faith that is still worth it. Eco-critics place their faith in poetry, novels, film, painting, installation art, philosophy, even popular culture when necessary. And again, even when our aim is deconstructive in nature, in order to expose and dismantle harmful narratives, the assumption is that criticism improves moral judgment. Why not include sacred texts and traditions of reading in religious communities within our orbit of inquiry and teaching? If you want books to move people to meaningful action in light of the climate crisis, why not seek to understand why and how reading moves people morally? And why not understand how that works in religious communities, especially since religion remains a significant aspect of world culture? Surely there are no more persuasive stories on the moral outlook of the human species than those that lay claim to our origins and highest purposes. When secular literature and scriptures are pitted against each other in a zero-sum competition, both forms of literature suffer, and the moral imagination is impoverished. In my own experience at a Christian religious university, the percentage of students who use their religion as a protection against learning are in a very small minority. The majority of students are motivated to learn precisely because of their faith, and good pedagogy would suggest tapping into those motivations rather than shaming or ignoring them. Raised myself in a Latter-day Saint community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or otherwise known as Mormon, I myself remember feeling an almost religious reverence about books I purchased for my first humanities class at Stanford University. I remember opening Homer's The Odyssey the first week of class, red pencil in hand, knowing that I was visiting a story that had inspired civilization for centuries, and now it was my turn to learn how and why. When I later read Wayne Booth's brilliant book, The Company We Keep, An Ethics of Fiction, his description of his own Latter-day Saint Mormon upbringing and its influence on his reverence for reading resonated deeply with me. Reverence and trust, of course, can also be pitfalls in the reading life, as literary criticism knows very well. But it is not clear to me, at any rate, why categorically trusting readers are any worse at good judgment than those infected by knee-jerk cynicism. Besides, in light of our climate crisis, we cannot afford to imply that critical thinking and reverence are mutually exclusive. As Bruno Latour has again insightfully demonstrated, building a culture of suspicion and distrust towards socially constructed knowledges contradicts an expectation that students can then turn to science to guide climate action. He suggests a turn to values, or what he calls matters of concern, rather than matters of fact. As Holmes Rolston, the theologian, puts it in his biting critique, we cannot rationally expect academics, seeped in nothing but constructed knowledge, to judge knowledge. Quote, illusion evaluating illusion is nonsense on stilts and soon collapses, end quote. Eco-critics, like all teachers in the humanities, want to arm students with critical thinking skills and powers of discernment sufficient to cut through the noise and deception of our fossil-fueled culture of acquiescence. And yet at the same time, eco-critics need and want to provide a world-altering new understanding of the world that can galvanize moral action and inspire hope. Not unlike the ways in which believing readers often describe their encounters with the Holy Word. Learning when and why to maintain critical distance and when and why to willingly suspend disbelief is an art that needs careful attention. What we need to teach, in other words, is neither categorical trust nor suspicion, but the art of discernment. Alan Jacobs' remarkable book, A Theology of Reading, is one example of how to balance criticism and trust, and it is noteworthy that he does so by seeking to blend secular and sacred traditions of literature. While models of reading sacred literature have erred on the side of excessive trust, models of reading secular literature have erred on the side of excessive distrust, limited by what Paul Ricoeur described as a hermeneutics of suspicion. In the end, what both traditions need is to face with courage what Jacobs calls, quote, the enormous risks of using discernment. Discernment becomes necessary when the expectations of the reader do not foreclose certain possibilities, neither the possibility of transcendent meaning nor of deception. Discernment is also, I would argue, what becomes necessary when we give primacy to problems over concepts, when we admit to ourselves that it is not obvious how to apply abstract ideals to concrete particulars until we roll up our sleeves and try. To insist overtly or to imply by virtue of our neglect that students must choose between the moral authority of the Bible and the moral authority of secular literature not only loses the audience of believing college students today, but it models an overly suspicious and self-defeating approach to reading, a posture that would rather suffer anything than the humiliation of being fooled, as Alan Jacobs so cleverly puts it. Climate change poses a fundamental and practical problem, that of excess carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And in keeping with Cohock's argument, this requires us, it seems to me, to use discernment to answer a rather pragmatic question. What will motivate the most people to reduce the most emissions? Emissions are a problem, in other words, that only worsen while we spend time arguing ad nauseum about who has the correct worldview. The culture wars that divide what we sometimes call secular or exclusive humanism from its religious countercultures have distracted us and compromised our ability to collaborate on behalf of the climate. I only want to suggest that eco-criticism should be ecumenical to the bone, that eco-critics should get religion in the sense that they should understand it. Sectarianism in all of its religious or secular variants is counterproductive to climate action. It has created the conditions of polarizing positions of mutual exclusivity. Either climate change is happening or is human caused, and all people of faith are fools, or climate change is exaggerated or false, and all secularists are godless devils. Surely these all-stake narratives might work to motivate climate change believing secularists, but that's about it. And it is a fair and practical question to ask, are climate change believing secularists really the ones who need motivation in any case? To borrow from a religious metaphor, this is the very epitome of preaching to the choir. Even in more secular cultures than the US, in, say, Germany, ecotheology is proving to play an important role. So it seems especially ludicrous to adopt a posture of antagonism or indifference toward theology in any context where any variety of faith motivates a good part of the culture. And it is worth asking, doesn't the work that it takes to preach only to the secular choir come at least some cost of further alienation, entrenchment, and resistance from religionists? Social science again tells us the answer is a definitive yes. As long as the worldviews imagined, articulated, and defended by eco-critics continue to insist that the only way to a sustainable future is for universal adoption of secular values, even if that is their personal preference, they would seem to be no less guilty of arrogance and intolerance than the most ardent religious climate denier who will not imagine that anthropogenic climate change is possible within a universe in which their God is sovereign. As much as I am a believer in the power of novels, poetry, and great nature writing, the literature that still moves the vast majority of the world's population to moral action in the world is sacred literature. And eco-theologians are providing the tools to release an environmental ethos from such texts. Worldwide, there is scarcely a religion today that does not have some articulation of an environmental ethic that is offered to redress climate change for believers. That isn't to say, of course, that every believer or religious community pays sufficient attention to those ideas or that they are widely practiced. I am not sure that ecotheology has a significantly better record of influencing measurable change than eco-criticism, but I am also not sure why the burden of proof for moral potency shouldn't be on poetry and novels before it should be on Holy Writ. At this point, the very suggestion that religion is either irrelevant or incompatible with environmental ethics is intellectually irresponsible and politically reckless. A dialogue between ecotheology and literature can help blur the boundary between the sacred and the secular. Eco-critics could use some metaphysical aspiration, just as eco-theologians need some literal and figurative grounding on earth. When they function as isms, religion and secularity betray their own highest and best ideals. Besides, maybe such blurring provides at least some basis for humility, for conjecture, or for contingent offerings about ultimate questions in a way that relieves us of the pressure to have definitive and final answers. Just as all secularists don't share the scientistic and reductionist views of, say, Richard Dawkins, not all religionists are obligated by their commitments and beliefs to make a creation museum in order to deny the whole of modern geology and biology. We might recognize that these stereotypes are not accurate, but that doesn't mean our familiarity with thinking on the other side of the secular religious divide shows sufficient understanding and nuance. It is time that we fix the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that really, really wonderful and rich lecture. I think there's so much for us to take and so much for us to learn from your talk today. Um, excuse me. So I think now we'll open the floor to the audience, and we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussions. So if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand so we can see you. So while we wait for others, I do actually have a question. So there's many, many different points that you mentioned in your talk, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on two things. One of the things is that in Taiwan or where I live, I think it has become like really, really secular. And you briefly mentioned Latour and how, even in the belief in, politics or politics of any kind is basically, it does have that religious tendency. But what I'm experiencing in the young people, or what I see in the young people nowadays, is basically indifference and apathy toward basically anything. So I guess the question is that the challenges that we're facing in a less, a more secular world in Taiwan today is how do we even have them or allow them to get interested in reading or in believing? That's the first question. And uh, I guess I'm more tending, I'm more a Buddhist than uh, I would call myself more a Buddhist than anything, but I'm not really engaged in any of the religious reading or religious rituals. And so I was wondering if you can elaborate how you would see that from a Christian point of view of uh, eco-theological or theological reading, and how that would be different from a critical reading that eco-critics would do. Do you see there's a difference between that? You know what I mean? Between a theological reading of sacred text or non-secular and a critical reading of, what eco-critics or what literary critics do.
Um, let me come back to that second question. I might need
Okay.
to ask for a little more clarification on that, but let me try to address the first one, which is a really interesting one. And I'm certainly very interested to know what you do, because I'm sure you try different things. So I don't mean to presume to know what the best thing to do is. But I think, and maybe this gets a little bit at the second question too. But I think there's real value in facilitating student experience with literature. By
Mhm.
that I mean, this idea that Kohak talks about the danger of the putting concepts ahead of experience. I think that's a really interesting way to think about literature. In other words, when we teach literature to students, I think what we're trying to do is facilitate an experience with
Mhm.
literature more than we are trying to communicate a set of ideas, even
Yeah.
though, of course, every text has ideas and we want them to come away with certain insights and ideas. But of course, most pedagogy experts will tell us that the most transformative teaching experiences we can offer our students are not going to be a series of concepts that we conveyed to them. It's going to
Mhm.
be a kind of experience they had in the class with the text, with one another, with you as the professor, and maybe if you incorporate some experiential learning or service or some practical aspect of the class, most pedagogy experts tell us that those are the kinds of things that are really going to stick with students. So I think really focusing on the experience, the lived experience of a text, and facilitating that as much as possible with students, whether it's slowing down enough to read it out loud to one another. And especially when we're talking about the environment, to actively connect it to the places where they live and to the environment they're in, whether that's rural or urban or whatever it is, helping them to sort of, make a connection between uh, the, the concepts that are in the work with the whole of their life experience. And so I think that the wonderful thing about environmental teaching, right, is that we have sort of a built-in excuse to get students outside of the
Mhm.
classroom. And I think the more my students get outside together and, guided by the readings that we've been doing in the class with a project in mind. We've got an ecological restoration project happening in my town with regard to our local river. And so, even just simple planting of native plants while we're
Mhm.
talking together. Um, I don't think it's that far fetched to say that these are, they have the equivalent of a kind of spiritual power that people describe in religious contexts. I had a spiritual experience. They have I would just say it's transformative. And,
Mhm.
the goal is to transform them. I don't think if they're, you know, hard-baked secular students, then obviously, my theory falls apart right away. And that is that you have to meet them where they're at. You've got to figure out
Mhm.
what worldview informs them and informs their attitudes, and then see if you can't appeal to it. I mean, of course, maybe I'm giving more credit than is due to young people. And some young people haven't formulated, their own worldview yet,
Mhm.
right? They're still
Mhm.
just kind of barely starting to think about it, but it's there, right?
Mhm.
They've got it.
Mhm.
They've inherited some ideas from family, from culture, from whatever their background is. And I think it's important to help bring that out, help them to
Mhm.
start to talk about it, even if it's
Mhm.
something that they reject, or that it's something that they're profoundly ambivalent about. If they can talk
Mhm.
about it as part of their experience, then I think it kind of loosens them up a little bit. Anyway,
Mhm.
I don't know if that. So tell me more, a little bit more about your second question again.
The second question is that, in a way, even though I think I'm more leaning toward the Buddhist side, but I don't really involve or engage in any religious churches, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you, with your religious background in Christianity, um, do you see a difference or do you distinguish between a theological reading of the sacred text or non-secular text and what we do as eco
I see.
critics or liter critics? I think with that question is
Yeah.
because I think friends or religious people that I encounter in Taiwan, they a lot of them tend to follow what the masters are doing and things like that. So I think in a way that for me it's preventing non-religious believers to act or to mobilize them in a way. So I was curious, what do you think about um, if there's a difference between theological reading and what we do as eco-critics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I was actually just teaching Basho's poetry today to my
Mhm.
a general education class, and we were talking about Buddhism, and sort of I was trying to help the students understand what would be the spiritual purpose of writing poetry. Why is Basho so intent on responding to the world that he sees in a spiritual way with poems? And I think it's true that in cultures of the book, most specifically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's such a strong emphasis on the book, right, that has the supreme authority over other books. There's more of a tension in those traditions between the sacred literature and secular literature. I think Hinduism and Buddhism, at least in my understanding, seem more fluid in the way in which those traditions have produced manifold literary responses that have varying degrees of sort of formal religious meaning, right? And I think that's quite fascinating. I think what's fun, at least in my experience with Judaism and Christianity, is that there's actually more subtlety there than it first meets the eye, because you have this long Jewish tradition of midrash, and you have apocryphal writings that surround the Bible. But then you have this extraordinary flourishing of visual art and poetry and drama and literature that is not written by people who are not trying to displace the Bible, but actually trying to respond to it as a kind of inspiration. So I think that's I I guess I guess one thought your question triggers is that we can be careful to help students understand whenever it's relevant to a particular text. um, there's an ongoing dialogue. I mean, I've studied quite a bit the poetry of Derek Walcott from the Caribbean, and Walcott himself is not religious, but his mother was deeply devout Methodist Christian. And you cannot read his poetry without noticing he's constantly in dialogue with his mother's belief, and he's constantly engaging those questions, and he's agonizing even over his inability to come to the same conclusions that his mother came to, but he does it in such a beautiful way. And I guess if students can't see that, right, I think, or if we don't bring that out in our readings of a text, I think it's a missed opportunity, just to be able to understand it, right? Even if we're not. But I ended up arguing that I still thought that Walcott was, even though he's agnostic on so many questions, I mean, he was never decided on whether or not he would ever see it. You know, there's a beautiful elegy he wrote about his mother, and he couldn't, after she died, and he could never decide if he would ever see her again. And he kept saying, well, you know, to believe that nothing, that after death is just nothingness, is something I can't quite accept. But to imagine that we're somehow going to, you know, sit down and have a conversation is also something I can't really understand, wrap my brains around. But to help students understand, do you see how his poetry is the vehicle by which he wrestles with that question and is the expression of his hope, even if he doesn't have definitive answers? Like that captures something that I think anybody can relate to, regardless of where they are on a particular, uh, you know, in the faith spectrum or whatever, that they can see that there's a relevance to religion in the way we read. So that's part of what I'm saying. I really don't. I was very. I mean, I have a much longer. I have two other chapters that are all theory in this book, but I'm really trying to be very careful not to say that, you know, there's something superior about literature that's religious, or there's something superior about theological readings of literature. All I'm saying is, um, if we bring that lens to it, new kinds of new kinds of answers open up, and they have a particular potency and power in moving us to want to care about the earth, you know, because ultimately, in Walcott's case, it's his ambivalence and his agnosticism that actually inspires his care for the earth. He concludes after his mother dies, even though I can't conclude anything else, he says, what I will do is I will praise this world, and I will love every flower. I will love every blade of grass because of who you were as my mother, and because you haunt me still. Kind of, I'm badly paraphrasing, but that's the essence of what his poetry is saying. And I think that's, again, a very valuable insight into how theology can open up our understanding of what literature is doing.
Great, thank you. I think we have about 10 more minutes, and I would like to open the floor to, I see Youting, a close friend of mine from National Zhongxin University. He has his hands up. So, Youting.
Hello. Uh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you, Professor Handley, for your very rich and inspiring talk. I mean, I wrote down a lot of notes while listening to your talk, and I'm not sure if I can make sense of them right now. So that means I'm looking very much forward to your book. But I think I want to start with the phrases that I actually wrote down while listening to your talk. You mentioned that. The current crisis of climate change is also a crisis of imagination. So I was wondering, so that means to me, so this to kind of take on this crisis to take this crisis head on, we also need to kind of revise or even revive our imagination of theology. So I believe you've written a lot about this in your discussion of the novels, but specifically right now it comes to my mind that some of the commercial or Hollywood style movies that kind of combine, some environmental disasters, but also, from the perspective of theology, especially Christian theology of damnation and salvation. So I was thinking, do you think that's also a secular version of eco-theology? And is that a feasible or unfeasible, interpretation of theology? I mean, is that a, physical imagination according to your understanding? Yeah. So this is my first question.
So can I ask a follow-up? You're talking about contemporary representations of climate disaster?
Yes, yeah, especially in film narratives
Yeah.
where a lot of, environmental disasters or climate changes, they are kind of uh, connected, I mean, to a greater or less extent with messages of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I was thinking if that's that's a secular response, a valid secular response to, our current situation.
I think that's a great question. I'm thinking of a few movies. Avatar certainly is a kind of, environmental disaster film that has strong theological, at least indigenous theological
Yes.
overtones,
Yeah.
borrowed from and mythologized in James Cameron's own way. And I think some other films might borrow from a kind of, Christian damnation story or a fall, a sort of, fall from paradise narrative. Some of that is overt and intentional, and some of it's just in some ways a way in which environmentalism has borrowed from the rhetoric of religion, but isn't really fully committed to a kind of
Mm,
theology, but is simply sort of borrowing from the power of a story in which, certain people get punished for their wickedness and other people get rewarded for their righteousness. Why not borrow from the power of that kind of narrative? I mean, one thing that it complicates my argument that I didn't even really get into, is that the theologies that I personally am the most persuaded by are very counterintuitive. They're not easy theologies at all. If you read Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she is not at all clear on who God is and what he's up to and why there's so much ugliness and violence in the natural world. And if you read Cormac McCarthy's The Crossing,
mm,
uh, it's not clear at all what McCarthy himself is committed to, uh, and it's certainly not clear that believing in God brings you anything
mm,
whatsoever in terms
mm,
of protections against suffering, right? So
mm,
there's the film Noah by that features Russell Crowe
mm,
by Aaron Aronofsky. I think it's a brilliant film because it does portray catastrophe, but it really shows the sort of moral complexity of Noah, right? Who is a bit of a tyrant and has to come to terms with his own intolerance for human evil, and sort of has to. He actually thinks at the end of the film that he's making a big mistake by allowing humanity to continue, and yet that turns out to be, I think, sort of the film's point. Anyway, my answer would be, theology for my taste and for my research, the theology that is the most effective is not the simple black and white kind of theology that says, here are the good guys and here are the bad guys and here's what's wrong. It's something that provokes something closer to what Greek tragedy does, right? It provokes profound self-questioning. It provokes awe and respect for, the creation, or for, physical life, but it doesn't make that path easy. And I think that's absolutely necessary in our time, because if we simplify the morality of what it means to be alive on the planet, then of course we're going to simplify our morality about what it means to fight for climate change. And if we simplify the morality to such a degree that we are not engaging in that self-questioning, and we're looking for a solution that allows an escape from all suffering, or allows an escape from all complexity, I think we're running into even worse problems. So I'm certainly convinced that theology matters, but I'm also convinced that there are some really dangerous theologies out there, and I do think the subtlety or the lack of subtlety in certain narratives is important to pay attention to, because that can tell us something about the overall effectiveness of the story. Because I actually don't think we respond instinctively very well to black and white morality. I think we're more attuned to the kind of complexity that great art achieves. I don't know if that's helpful, but I do think there's a lot of promotion of superficial theology. Some of it's explicit and overt, some of it's just borrowed. But I would say Avatar is an example of a film that's very clearly trying to make a theological case for, multiple intelligences and subjects in the natural world, borrowed from indigenous belief and from ecology itself. And and it wants that to be kind of that is counterposed directly to exploitive capitalism, right? That's a narrative that's not hard to miss in that story. But I think Noah's a film that portrays climate disaster in a much more complex way, and really points to the importance of being forgiving of ourselves and showing mercy on ourselves, but proceeding with great caution and humility. I think there's some power to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Complexity does matter. I mean, in this kind of discussion or narratives of theology. And I think that also has to do with my second question. I mean, that has to do with plural perspectives of theology or ecotheology. Because when you are talking about this crisis of imagination, you also talked a little bit about some cultural understanding. I mean, kind of feel like that by to kind of take on this crisis imagination, we also need to expand our cultural understanding by including more more perspectives from different communities, theological communities. So I was also thinking, I mean, if is this kind of when we celebrate or when we embrace this plurality or plural perspectives of theology, I mean, how do we avoid falling prey into a kind of a relativism? Yeah, is that a valid concern or is it not? I was thinking that if we try to kind of, encourage this kind of plurality when we talk about theology and ecology, then is there a possibility that, at the end of the day, we just agree to disagree? And does that really advance our, our agenda in kind of want to put ecology into dialogue with ecotheology?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer adequately. I can only say that, I mean, I would sort of take one sort of false, there's a false binary, the false dichotomy that operates in our culture today, and that is along the lines of what you were just describing. It's like you either believe in your one worldview with religious devotion and you're intolerant of everybody else, or you sort of accept that there's plurality there, and that means you're falling into kind of relativism. And while I think both of those positions are real ones, I don't mean to say that they don't exist. They're very real, but I think what's misleading is the assumption that those are, like those two positions are mutually exclusive. You can't trust in and believe in a worldview at the same time that you exercise, tolerance and even compassionate imagination, and even grant validity to alternative worldviews. That's what I was quoting. Now I'm forgetting who it was I was quoting at some point in the paper, but I was talking about how important it is within worldviews. And I would say this is true within religious worldviews or within various secular philosophies. It's and I've been studying ecotheology and theology generally enough to just get a sense of this, that there's a really beautiful understanding of how important it is that every religion, for example, has a theology of other religions. Like, in other words, that, because most religions have a narrative about how they were born, right? How they came to be, or how humanity came to be from their story. But what is not always explicit, but needs to be teased out in every religious tradition, is what is the theology that tradition has of other faiths. So, for example, in the Bible, in Genesis, you have a theology that's clearly stated about what it means to belong to the house of Israel, but there's not it's more implicit about what it means to be a non-member, or to be a stranger, to be a foreigner in that land. But there are all kinds of ethics that are built into the book of Genesis about how to treat strangers, and about the people of other belief systems that are already surrounding that faith community. The point being that it's extraordinarily valuable for a religious tradition to develop a compassionate, generous theology as to why other religions exist at all, and that can invite a more ecumenical spirit with which religion. So I think if you pay attention to how ecumenism is practiced in religious communities across in interfaith dialogue, you're seeing a really beautiful and powerful example of how to balance those two positions, because they're people who are not forsaking their own beliefs in order to enter into interfaith dialogue. They're still entering in with their own convictions, but they have a generosity and a theology even of why their God obligates them to listen and treat peaceably and compassionately people of other faiths. I think there's something that the secular world can learn from that, right? That there's a way in which we can balance the two.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you.
Because I do think, ultimate, like, sort of radical pluralism is not necessary. It's less moving. I think maybe this goes back to Serena's opening question, but I do think students need something that moves them. They want to believe in something, that's ultimate and matters, right? Even if they can't have
Yes.
the confidence that but I think if we can teach students that you don't have to believe that your answer is the only answer, but you can trust in certain narratives and certain values and believe in them and live by them, and you can have a life of integrity and meaning, even if you don't have answers to lots of things. Because when you dig in under the surface of good theology and you look at actually what literature even says about religious experience, you can see all kinds of room for uncertainty and questions and collaborations, right?
Yeah, so that means that the set of beliefs that the students stand by are actually subject to different contingencies, right? So that's more like a secular
Yeah.
description of theology. That means they still have something to cling to, but depending on the circumstances, they can also feel comfortable adjusting to others' care and concerns, right?
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah.
I think that we're running a little bit late, but maybe we have one short question. If not, yeah. So if not, I guess we'll end here. And I would like to thank Professor George Handley on behalf of everyone in the audience. And I would say that we look forward to your book and maybe, excuse me, I have a cold today. So we also look forward to maybe part 2 or part 3 of your lecture with us and your visit to Taiwan sometime very soon. Thank you very much.
I would very much look forward to that. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.